don't know where my phone is. If it rings, it'll ring.
Okay. I am Halivni, along with Peleg Levy for Toldos Israel. We are sitting with Carol
Stone, Applbaum.
Right. On March 13th, 2019 in Jerusalem. And we are going to be talking about your uncle, Dewey Stone.
Right.
Why don't we start, though, tell us a little bit about you, when you were born, where you were born, your family, and then we'll get into
Okay. I was born in 1932. I'm still shocked when I wake up in the morning. It's like, oh, again? So it was a long time ago. In Brockton, Massachusetts, which is a small town that not many people heard of. It was probably the shoe capital of the country. And Rocky Marciano came from there, who was a well-known fighter. And Uncle Dewey was one of his backers, actually. And I grew up in a very warm, loving family. My mother was one of 9 children, and they all, with the exception of 2, lived in Brockton. Exception of 3 lived in Brockton, so we were a very close family. And as a matter of fact, my grandfather would wake up every morning and he would go for a walk, and he would walk. His son lived upstairs from him, and my Aunt Pearl lived across the street, and Uncle Dewey lived around the corner, and Uncle Harry lived around the corner from him, and then my mother lived around the corner from them, and my Uncle Abe lived up the street from us, and that was his walk every single morning. And so I knew that I was going to see my grandfather every day. And my father was one of 5. None of them lived in Brockton.
what were your parents' names?
My father was Ed Teplow, and my mother was Evelyn Stone Teplow. And my 2 of my father's siblings lived in Palestine. My grandfather had come to America from the Ukraine, from Kiev, in 1912. And he was not religious. They didn't keep a kosher home. There was absolutely no religion, but he was a vibrant Zionist. And he only wanted to live in Palestine. And I never knew my grandfather until 1938. He made Aliyah, well, it wasn't called Aliyah then. He just moved to Palestine in 1932 when I was born. And wrote a letter to my mother in 1934, which I had somewhere, saying that this is the only place to bring up a Jewish child. And there's Judaism in the streets, and that's what you feel. And if you want your children to remain Jewish, this is where to bring them. And he came back in 1938 because he was diabetic. He was Dr. Jocelyn's, one of his first insulin patients. And a memory that is engraved in my memory is him sitting at my aunt's house down at the Cape, that she had a double, glider. And Joe was sitting, my oldest brother was sitting opposite him. My brother Ted was sitting next to him. I was sitting on his lap. And he was teaching them Hebrew because it was very crucial that kids knew the language. And it was very important. And I remember him impressing this. And I was like 6, 5. I was 5 at the time. And he was a tall, elegant gentleman. I'll show you his picture over there. Very elegant gentleman. And he came without my grandmother because he was not well. We came back to Brockton, and my only other memory of him is my mother asked me to do something. And being a typical little bratty kid, I said no. Well, that was, I think, the last time I ever said no to my mother, because my grandfather took me by the arm, and he's 6'2", and I'm a little kid, and he said, "You have the best mother in the entire world. don't you ever say no to your mother again. If she asks you to do something, you do it. And I just remember trembling. And whenever I said no to my mother, if I did, again, my grandfather was right there in front of me. It was really, so those are my two memories of my grandfather. He passed away the night of the Great Hurricane in 1938. And we weren't allowed to go to the Levy because in those days you didn't bring kids to a funeral. We had to stay home, and we were told that we had to sit and be quiet and just behave because we had, out of respect to my grandfather. And I guess I wasn't. And my brothers told on me. And my father came home, and the girl that was staying with us told my father that I really hadn't behaved very nicely. And I got the beating of my life. My father took me up into the attic and he spanked me so hard. It was great. So that was my grandfather. My grandmother had had a stroke after my grandfather died, and she came back to America in 1941 with her two other children. And she had been left aphasic by the stroke. And they all came to our house. Everybody. There were my two aunts and uncles, and a baby had been born, and he had been bombed out of his crib in Tel Aviv. And that's why they had to come back. My father sent them tickets, and they came by way of Bombay by ship, and they all stayed at the house. And I said to my mother, "Where are you going to put everybody?" We had a little house. And it wasn't a little house, but it was adequate for 5 of us, but it wasn't adequate for 10 or 11 people. And my mother, that was my biggest lesson. When you're Jewish, your walls have to be made out of elastic. And there's always room for the family. No matter how many, there's room for the family. So my grandmother took my room, and my one aunt and uncle took my brother's rooms. My brothers went up to the attic. Another aunt and uncle slept out on the sun porch, and the baby slept out there with them. And I slept on a mattress in my parents' bedroom. And this was before dishwashers, it was before deliveries, it was before washer and dryers, it was before all of the modern conveniences. And I said to my mother, how are you going to manage? She said, with love. That's how you manage. And it was. She was so excited that they were coming, and these were her in-laws. And she was just so excited, and it was wonderful. It was just wonderful. So I learned a huge lesson from that. And but I never spoke to my grandmother because she couldn't speak. So the only thing I learned from her was love, because that's how she treated my mother. And she just adored my mother. My mother adored her. And she could knit, and without a pattern. And she made my mother hats and coats and suits and sweaters, a sweater that I had until after I was married to my second husband in the 1980s. I mean, can you imagine, from 40 years? It was really 45 years. It was incredible. And that was my family growing up. And then, of course, they stayed in Brockton. And 2 of my brother's siblings lived in New York. Well, actually, one in Milwaukee, and then in Phoenix, Arizona, and one in New York. And even though they were out of town, we were still very close with them. And Uncle Dewey was a huge factor.
Was your family traditional?
My mother kept a kosher home. My father came from nothing. And my mother asked him before they got married if it would be okay with him if she kept a kosher home. He said, "The kitchen is yours, you do whatever you want, and I will follow you." So that was fine. In 1938, when my grandfather died, I don't think my father even sat Shiva, because I don't think he knew he had to. He certainly didn't say Kaddish for him, because he couldn't read Hebrew, and we belonged to an Orthodox shul that was built by my great uncle. My mother's uncle built the shul on the east side of town. So we went Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and God forbid we should get into a car on those days. I mean, no. So we walked, and it was a long walk, but that's what you did. You went to shul 3 days a year and finished, done. I didn't know from a Shabbos, I didn't know from a Yontif, other than Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. And my father, what happened is my brothers were sent to a camp, an overnight camp, and they wrote a letter to my father that the Reform rabbi took them out fishing. That was okay. Taught them how to fish for clams. But then they came back to camp, and the rabbi started to show them how to open them and eat them. And they knew that was a no-no. You couldn't do that. We never ate tafis. We never ate any pig products. We never ate any shellfish. It was incredible. And my father was furious because my father, number one, was a purist. Number two, if you did something, you did it all the way, and it was his way or the highway. So all of a sudden, this isn't what he wanted his kids to do. So he took them out of, but they were at Hebrew school in the Reform Temple. He took them out of that Hebrew school, and there was no conservative. So he went to put them into the Orthodox Hebrew school. In those days, it was a 5-day-a-week Hebrew school. But he's not just going to put them there. He's going to find out what's involved. He's going to find out what they're teaching them. He was very much involved in his kids. And from that, he started to learn with the rabbi. By the time my grandmother died in 1947, I think it was, I was 15, and my other grandmother had also died the same year. So when I was 15, I had one grandfather left, my mother's father. And my father said, well, if my kids are going to learn, then I guess I have to learn, because I can't have them learning something I don't know. So my parents started to learn Hebrew with the rabbi, and how to read and how to write and what, everything was all about. And that started him on his path to becoming a Baal Tshuva. I was still in high school, and I was still eating cream chip beef for lunch in school, And all of a sudden, the whole world is changing. And if it's good for him, it's good for everybody. Okay? And it was just, what can I tell you? So I went to school. I graduated high school.
Do you remember the rabbi's name?
The rabbi was Herman Spiro. He's passed away.
Herman
Spiro. S-P-I-R-O. He passed away. My father became very involved in the shul. He became head of the education committee. He was really very, very involved. My mother was very involved in Hadassah. They put up new mezuzahs in the house. And every week there was a new thing that they were doing. And it was really kind of comical, because you never knew what to expect. So one week he decided to put up the car, and one week he decided to stop turning on lights. And I remember when I went to, this was in 56, because my brother had met Mimi already, and they were going to get married. And my father was, and she was a Feuerstein. She came from a very, very religious home.
Like Aaron Feuerstein, like that same family? Moses Feuerstein?
It was the same family. Mo Feuerstein, who was head of the Orthodox Union for 12 years, I think, was a half-brother to Mimi's father. They had the same father, but different mothers.
Malden Mills?
Right. So Malden Mills and Aaron and Mo were half-brothers, and Aaron and Mimi's father, I think, were also half-brothers. Mm-hmm. So Mimi was coming to the house for a Shabbat, and all of a sudden I see my mother going upstairs, and the woman who usually came in to help serve on Friday night was going upstairs too. And I'm like, why is Helen going upstairs with Mom? Dad says, because Mom is showing her what lights to leave on and leave off. And I said, oh. okay, we want Mimi to be comfortable in this house. I'm thinking, that's great, I fixed them up, okay. And she's going to be comfortable and I don't. That's great. That's really great. Okay. All right. Whatever turns you on. And there was one week we went out and the telephone was ringing Friday night. We always answered the phone Friday night. All of a sudden, sit. I got up to answer the phone. He said, sit down. I said, Dad, the phone's ringing. He said, sit down. Dad, sit down. We're not answering the phone anymore. Okay, and your father said sit, you sit. Well, so, and then gradually, you know.
You're already 24.
Yeah.
You're not a...
I'm not a youngster, I'm married. I'm already married, okay? Ellie was an infant. Ellie's now 61 years old. Ellie was an infant. So, all right. And it was perfectly okay for me to come out on Friday and go back to Boston on Friday. To be Machal Shabbos was okay, as long as we were with them on Shabbat. You know? I mean, it was very funny. And this is going along gradually, and my father becomes known as the radical. I mean, he's the radical guy. Nobody's doing this in Brockton. Hello. And all of a sudden, Ed Templer becomes like the chief of observance. And he became president of Mizrahi, of the New England region of Mizrahi. He was the national treasurer at the OU for a number of years. He really just bloomed and blossomed. It was great for him. And it took us a lot longer to come around, but my father certainly set the path and set the tone, and was he clearly was a follow me kind of guy, and my mother was not quite as adamant as my father, but it meant a great deal to her as well. And whatever made my father happy, that's what she was willing to do. They set beautiful examples for me, I must tell you, and of what it means to be a parent and how to parent. I'm not sure I emulated them that well, but they set the good examples. And so that was the home that I grew up in. And Dewey, Uncle Dewey and my father were best friends. And that's how my father married my mother. Because Dewey said to him, what do you think about taking out my sister? And my father said, fine. And that was it. And so
let's go back. So for a second. So now Dewey, what do you know about when his family, or when he was born, or
I don't
or his
really
parents?
know.
His parents were your
my grandparents were my grandparents. I knew that he loved to play basketball, or what do you call it when you bang it against a wall?
Handball?
Handball.
Yeah.
He liked to play handball, and my father liked to play handball. And that's where they met at the community center in Brockton. And that's when they became very, very good friends. They were exactly the same age, Uncle Dewey and my father.
Born in...
My father was born in Kiev, and Uncle Dewey was born... I believe... Dewey was born in Brockton. Because Dewey was the next one to my mother. My mother was 8 of 9. Dewey was 7 of 9. And
what year were they?
Dewey was born in 1900. My mother was born in 1903. And my mother died in 61. My youngest was 8 months old, and Ellie was 3.
Now, did you know these grandparents?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
So these grandparents were...
This grandfather was at my wedding.
Okay.
Okay. And he had a great sense of humor. So you never knew when he was faking that he had dementia or whether he was just being very funny, because he had a tremendous sense of humor.
What were their names, these grandparents?
My grandfather was Moshe Morris. My son is named after both my grandfathers. My youngest son is Moshe Yitzchak. So Moshe is after my grandfather, my mother's father. Yitzchak is after my father's father. And he was just a very, very loving, wonderful man. My grandmother had dementia from before I was born, so I didn't really know her as a person, as a whole person.
And their last name was Stone.
The last name was Stone, right. And I married a Stone, but two different families. And so I don't know much about their growing up, except they were a very, very close family. And how do I know that? Because every Sunday, all of them would come to our house every Sunday. And we would play my one uncle would play the violin, and my mother would play the piano. My mother played beautifully by ear. You could hum a tune, and she could just run with it. She was great, and she had also a professionally trained voice, so she sang beautifully. And these are my parents right there. So this is on their honeymoon over here, and that's around their 25th wedding anniversary, which was celebrated at Uncle Dewey's house. And and my parents got married in Uncle Dewey's garden. Why? Because Uncle Dewey came to say goodbye to my grandparents. They were going on vacation. They had been married 2 years. They were going on vacation for a couple of weeks. And he comes to the house and he sees a ladder going up to my mother's bedroom. And he goes around the house and, what's the ladder doing there? Well, my father's at the ladder. And he says, Ed, what are you doing? So my father said, well, we're going to elope because your mother has 9 children. And they can't afford to make a wedding, and it's not fair to impose that on them. And so we just thought we'd go away and get married and save them the expense of a wedding. And Dewey says, come here, you can't do that. You can't do that. He said, you're the oldest in your family. My mother, Evelyn, is the next to youngest. You can't do that to your parents. Your parents deserve to see their child properly wed. If you can wait 2 weeks or 4 weeks, we'll be back from our vacation. You'll get married in our garden. We'll make you a wedding. You don't have to worry about the expense of my parents. Is that okay with you? And my father said, yeah, that's fine. And that's what they did. And that's how they got married in Uncle Dewey's garden. He was living in Taunton at the time.
No, so this is Dewey and Ed, your father,
right.
are
best friends.
Best friends, same
right.
age.
Right.
And
right.
And Dewey offers his own house.
Exactly. His garden.
How old was Dewey?
Dewey was, this
father?
was 1925. He was 25.
Where did he get money from?
He was working for his brother-in-law. They were in the manufacturing business. They manufactured linings, I believe, for fabrics for raincoats. And Dewey was the outside man, and he would go and make all the sales and talk to all the customers. And Uncle Nate was the inside man and ran the factory and ran the shop. And they were very successful from day one. Uncle Nate, who was married to Dewey's oldest sister, so there was a big age range between the oldest and the third from youngest. And they were very successful together from day one. So, and in those days, a wedding didn't cost what it costs today. It's not, And I had a diary from my father's sister, youngest sister. I don't know what I did with it, but she wrote down the entire wedding, what my mother looked like, what my father looked like, what Uncle Dewey looked like, and my Uncle Lou, who also lived in Taunton, was a very handsome guy. And, the whole thing was written out. I cried when I read it. And I read it at Ellie's Ufruf, so that he should hear how his grandparents got married and what their wedding looked like. And it was really interesting. But Uncle Dewey was a giver. He was just a giver from day one. We had the same high school teacher for English. She taught Uncle Dewey, who was brilliant. She taught my brother Ted, who was brilliant. And then she taught me. I wasn't brilliant. I didn't come up to their shoelaces, either one of them. But I learned 2 things from her. She said to me, you know what makes you, and she adored my Uncle Dewey. She said, you know what makes your Uncle Dewey great? She was not Jewish and she was never married. She said, it's not his world fame that makes him a great man. What makes him a great man is that he never forgot who he was and where he came from. He came from a family. His family always came first. He came from a community. His community always came second. And then came the rest of the world. But he was all about family and community, and that's what you should remember about your Uncle Dewey. And that, coming from a high school teacher, really spoke volumes to me then, and today it still speaks volumes to me. And the other thing she taught me was always consider the source. If somebody gives you a compliment, consider the source. If you respect the person, if he's somebody that's worthwhile and worthy of respect, then take the compliment seriously, and if he criticizes you, you take that seriously as well. But if it's somebody you don't respect, or somebody that you don't think is worthy of emulation, then don't accept the compliment and don't take the criticism. And she said, and if you learn nothing else in this class, if you don't learn a word of English, remember those two things. And I've never forgotten them. It stood me in good stead.
Tell me a little bit about Dewey.
And when I was
okay, go ahead.
when I was a kid, Uncle Dewey was always there. They had no children.
He was married.
He was married, and they never had children. They had 17 nieces and nephews, all of whom were considered their children. And they treated each and every one of them like they were their children. And I remember clearly when he bought me my very first bedroom set, I was 9 years old, and it was gorgeous. And I thought that I had just been crowned a princess. It was beautiful. It was a white bedroom set with hand-painted hearts and flowers on the drawers of the bureau, and there was a cutout heart shape in the headboard of the bed with flowers painted around it, and a dressing table with a mirror. I mean, 9 years old, who has a dressing table? Really? It was like the world had opened up. I mean, I had just been given gold. It was very exciting. He gave me, I still have the gold watch that he gave me for my high school graduation. He taught me how to ice skate. He taught me how to go down a very steep hill on a sled. And he went with me in Brockton when it snowed. And he was just a wonderful teacher, and his family was always included. When he was chairman of UJA for a number of years, United Jewish Appeal for, I think, 8 years or something like that. He would have events in Brockton for the Brockton Federation, and I remember Alban Barkley, the vice president to Roosevelt, I believe, came to Brockton, and he introduced me as his niece to Vice President. But, well, who? I mean, it wasn't a vice president of a company or an organization. This is a vice president of the whole country. Who does that? And Mr. Barkley took my hand and he kissed it. And I didn't think I was ever going to wash that hand again. I was a kid. And he was not a handsome man by any manner of means, but the vice president of the country, really? It was awesome. And then he brought Eddie Cantor. I don't know if that name means anything to you, but he was a huge comedian. And I have his autograph on a picture of a log company, a log cabin up in Montpelier, Vermont. And Eddie Cantor gave me his autograph, and he was, I mean, and Uncle Dewey was just like that. You know, his family always came first. And I mean, why would he bother to introduce me to these people? I wasn't important. And it was just very exciting to be his niece. And no birthday was ever forgotten. No anniversary was ever forgotten. It was remembered with a card, with a postcard, with a telephone call, sometimes with a gift, sometimes not. But no matter where he was in the world, that card came on the date of your event. No matter, he could be in London, he could be in China, he could be anywhere. That card came to you when it was supposed to be there. And not just me, the entire family. Every birthday got a card. I mean, it was really special. And he adored my mother. And then he used to come when he was involved in helping to found the state. I had no idea what was going on, but we were told that Uncle Dewey had to make telephone calls, and he's not to be disturbed, and we're not to go upstairs when he's on the phone. His phone was being tapped. Our phone was not. And he was making all the calls to buy these arms and to buy the boats that were going to the Haganah. I had no idea. I had no idea. But that's what he was doing, and he was doing it from my mother's house. And he was very, very shashtil about whatever he was doing. He never wanted the covet to come to him. He never was one to say, it's all about me. It was never about him. He was a modest, he lived in a beautiful home, but very modestly by anybody's standards. And he was a people person. He absolutely could command your attention without demanding it. if you get, you know, he, as my brother said, he just eyeballed you, and he had you like in the palm of his hand. He was a very charismatic, without being a showman person, genuine. He put all of his nephews into a business. He would buy a business and that was going belly up, and he would say, you go into this business, bring it back to life. And that's what he would do. He did it with all of his nieces and nephews, not his nieces, but all of his nephews, and the nephews that came into the family also. My husband being one of them, and my husband was a lawyer, and Uncle Dewey had bought this frame company called Raymond Company, and he set another guy that I had gone to college with in there, and Lenny was a real go-getter, and he put my husband in also to watch what was going on. So Yuri had to give up his law practice and do this. It was not easy. He went in, and then just about then we were also going through our own Baal Tshuva journey, if you will. And I remember one day Lenny, who's the other party, called me and said, you know, this year we made X numbers of dollars, and next year we're going to triple that. But your husband has to come in 24/7. I said, Lenny, I can't afford you. That's not something he can do. He said, well, if he doesn't come in 24/7, then it's not going to happen. I said, I don't want my kids to remember a dollar bill. I want my kids to remember a father. I want my kids to remember a principle. So if you make it in 2 years, you make it in 3 years, the world isn't going to come to an end. But he didn't want to hear any of that, and Yuri ultimately had to give up the business and go back into law, which was very hard to do. And Uncle Dewey was supportive. But this is what he did, and every single nephew went in to manage another business that he bought for them. How many uncles who have no children do that? He was involved with everything in the family, at the same time being involved all over the world at this point. But as a kid, I remember him as being just a loving, warm, generous, funny, guy that you loved being with. And you know, anytime somebody would say, you're Dewey Stone's niece, it's like, yeah. You know, it was very exciting for me. And everybody, when I married a Stone, everybody thought that there was a family. There wasn't. My father-in-law and Dewey were very, very close friends. But they didn't know that they were going to end up being related to each other. And I met my husband at a ZOA dinner, and I don't know whether, I don't think Dewey was there at that time, but somebody that I was seeing at the time introduced me to my husband. And then ultimately we got married. And he said, this is the dumbest thing I'm ever going to do. And I said, why? He said, because you're going to marry him, and you're not going to marry me, because your parents are going to love him and they hate me. And he was right, absolutely straight on. And I said, don't be ridiculous. Well, P.S., the end of the story is, yeah, I did marry him. And at that wedding, there were gehackte Stones, because there was our Stone family and his Stone family. And a cousin of, interestingly enough, my best friend at that time, when I was a teenager, happened to be a first cousin to my husband. But I didn't know that at the time. I met her before I met him. And her grandson has done a movie for his high school project a couple of years ago, connecting my father-in-law and Uncle Dewey. So you might be interested in talking to him also, because I don't know. He went through some of the papers at the Jewish...
American Jewish Historical Society?
Correct, at Brandeis. And I guess he went and he saw some of the papers there. And so he's done a connection between my father-in-law and my Uncle Dewey. And the famous story goes that they met, the two of them met for dinner one night in New York City at the train station. Not Penn Station, the other one, Central Station.
Grand Central.
Yeah, Grand Central. And my father-in-law ordered oysters. And Dewey was shocked. He said, where is it written that you're not going to be struck by lightning from your eating oysters? My father-in-law said, I love them. And interestingly enough, my father-in-law was a graduate of Slobodka Yeshiva in Europe. Came here as an observant Jew, threw it all away, okay? Met my mother-in-law, who was the first Orthodox Jewish family in Worcester, Massachusetts. They kept a kosher home. End of story. End of story. There was no more Shabbos. There was no more anything. What's going on here? Like most of the Jews who came in the 20s, they shed their Judaism to make a living. And my father-in-law was one of them. But when we started to go out, Yuri and I, and my father wanted to take his mother out, his mother said to him, is it okay if I order lobster? And he said, not in your life. You cannot order lobster when you go out with my father-in-law, with my future father-in-law. That's not happening. So, okay, that was, God works in very, very strange ways. My father was going through his journey. He had decided to stop eating fish out. Didn't tell anybody. Didn't tell a soul. And we go to a very good restaurant, he orders tuna fish, and everybody's hysterical. Dad, why are you ordering tuna? I mean, this is such a good restaurant. Why are you ordering tuna fish? I'm not really that hungry. I just want tuna fish. He didn't say anything. We all ordered fish, my brothers and me and my mother. And the whole meal comes, and my mother says, this really tastes like soap. And I ate mine. You're right, it does. And all of us, the fish tasted like soap. So she gave it back to the waiter. She said, something must have happened in the kitchen. She said, can you check what's going on? Because all the fish taste like soap. Comes back 10 minutes later. He says, I don't know what to say to you, but there was a box of Rinso. I don't know if you remember Rinso, but it was a powdered soap on top of the counter. And apparently it spilled all over the today I'm saying, Hashem, you really knew what to do. We all ended up with tuna fish. It was really funny. So, but Uncle Dewey, as I say, kept a strictly kosher home, and that was it. We were married in his garden because he wanted to keep the tradition. He married my parents, okay. So Aunt Ann spent the summer planting the garden for our wedding, and it was all pink and white and green, and it was beautiful. And her garden were like her children. She took care of that garden daily, and was devoted to the garden. And it was a beautiful, beautiful wedding. It all canopied and tented. And to show you what kind of a person he was, the tent was being put up in a hurricane. The hurricane was Thursday, the wedding was Sunday, the tent had to be put up. He didn't let those guys out there by themselves. He was out there putting up the tent with them, trying to hold the poles. And I remember my mother standing with the wedding gown over her arm on the porch, looking out to the garden. And Aunt Ann is there, and Aunt Ann is like, it's going to kill him. This is going to kill him. And my mother felt terrible. This is her brother too. It's her, her sister-in-law's husband. And my mother felt terrible but he wasn't going to let those guys out there by themselves, and he was out there putting up that tent with them. I mean, who does, he was just wasn't full of himself. It was always, what can I do for you? I remember the science building of Boston University. It's the Dewey D. Harry K. Stone Science Building. Why? Because apparently Federation was donating the building, and they didn't get enough funds. So Dewey and Harry told BU that they would contribute the remaining amount of the funds on two conditions. Number one, that they stripped their quota totally. In those days, every college had a quota. It was 30% Jewish, 30% black, and the rest white. And only on that condition would they get the money. So BU was the first university in the country to drop the quota. And they got the Stone building. I believe that the cornerstone of the Stone Science building, and the corner is half of the stone of the Weitzman Administration building, because that's also the Dewey and Ann Stone Administration building at Weissman. They're connected because they were put up practically at the same time. And I think it was the same stone, but I'm not exactly sure. And Dewey, the other thing as part of our, we was a child, he graduated high school at 16. And every day he would go into Boston. He desperately wanted to go to school, but nobody would take him. He was too young. So he would go to BU every day, and he would sit on the steps, BU, in his knickers. And though you know what knickers are? In his knickers and in his socks. And President Marsh would come by every day and see him. And one day, President Marsh stopped. He said, "Young man, I see you sitting here every single day. What are you doing here?" And Uncle Dewey said, "Well, I want to go to school, but they won't let me because I'm too young." So President Marsh said, "Come with me. Come up to my office. Let me give you a test. And if you pass muster, then you can go down and you can come into school if you want to go to school that badly." He went up, tested him, gave him a note. He said, "Go down, give the bursar this note, and tell them that I said it's all right for you to come into school. You passed the test." So he did, and he went to school at 16 years old. He went to BU. He graduated when he was 20. It was 4 years. And then he went to the business school, and he got a Bachelor of Business. And and that was how he went to college. He was just a brilliant guy.
When did things start though with Zionism?
They started.
Was anybody Zionist in your house? I mean, you had mentioned your family that had gone
Right.
to
Well, my family was very Zionistic. My father was an ardent Zionist as well, but again, not observant. But if you stop to think of who settled this country, it wasn't the observant Jew that settled this country. It was the Zionist, non-observant Jew that came here with their blood, sweat, and tears, and really settled this country. It wasn't for lack of trying, you know, because the rabbis did petition Roosevelt, and he wouldn't let them in. I think it started, he was always an ardent Zionist, Dewey. And ZOA was important. And I remember when I was 11, it was 43, and they asked me to be president of the Young Judea Club. I didn't know what that meant. I had no clue. And my father sat me down, and my father gave me lessons on what it means to be president. And how to do it, and what to do, and how to, and I had to be very careful about how I conducted myself and how I presented myself, because I represented something now. It wasn't just that I represented them, but I remember as a kid growing up, my parents always said to me, just remember, you represent us when you walk out of this door. The way you look, the way you behave, the way you dress, you represent your parents. Don't embarrass us. You don't want us to embarrass you, don't embarrass us. Remember that. People don't tell their kids that today. You know, that doesn't work. Uncle Dewey, I always knew him to be active in the community and in the larger community. I mean, Uncle Dewey was always larger than life. That's just how he came across. Not because of, not that he expected that, but there was always publicity about him because he was always here and there and he was doing stuff. I think when he was 40, that was when he met Weitzman. And that was crucial, because he mentions that the largest influence outside of his family was Weitzman. Chaim Weitzman. He was like a father to Dewey, and Dewey treated him like he was his son. He really worshipped him, and I mean, the story is told, and I'm sure you've heard it, that he was being honored Dewey was being honored one night at a B'nai B'rith dinner, and Frank Goldman came in. And he looked at Dewey and he said, "You look terrible. What's wrong?" And Dewey said, "I don't know what to do. Weitzman has to meet Truman. Truman won't see him, and I don't know how in the world I don't know who to call to enable Weitzman to get in to see Harry Truman." And Goldman said, "You know, I just came from a dinner where Eddie Jacobson, Truman's partner in the haberdashery store, was honored at a B'nai B'rith dinner." Frank Goldman was the national chairman of B'nai B'rith, and he was out in Kansas, in Missouri, he was someplace. And he said, "Eddie Jacobson was there. Let's give him a call and see if we can't get him to ask Truman to see Weitzman." So they went around collecting quarters and dimes and nickels to put into the payphone to call Eddie Jacobson to see if he would intervene with Truman. So he's sound asleep. He's bored to death. That's okay. Are we still on?
Take a step back. So what happened at the dinner?
So at the dinner, they collected all this change from everybody, and they went outside and they made a call to Eddie Jacobson. And Dewey clued him in as to who Chaim Weitzman was and how important it was for Chaim Weitzman to get to see Truman so that he would recognize the state before the UN assembly in 1947. And they talked to Eddie Jacobson. It was a long telephone call, and Jacobson agreed to do it. He said, I'll meet you tomorrow morning in New York. I'll come in from Missouri, and you'll come in from Boston, and we'll meet and we'll talk. And that's exactly what happened. Dewey went to New York in the morning, and he met Jacobson, and they talked, and Dewey, with Weitzman, and they clued him in and as to exactly what was going on. And Jacobson went to Truman. And Truman was like, well, you know, Eddie, you know, what do you want? He was very gruff, and his wife was a virile anti-Semite. Mrs. Truman wouldn't allow a Jew to cross her threshold. And Truman wasn't like that, but his wife was. And if you were a Jew, forget it, except for Eddie Jacobson. And Truman was like, you've never asked me for anything before, so I guess I have to honor this. But he's to come in the side door, because I said not another soul. I wasn't going to see another Jew about this incident, about this affair, and bring him in the side door that nobody should see him. And so Chaim Weitzman came in the side door, and Dewey and Truman fell in love with him. And he didn't call him Chaim, he called him Cham, because he couldn't pronounce the Ch. As my Spanish teacher said, Jewish kids don't have a problem, but for you who aren't Jewish, I'll tell you how to pronounce it. Get some phlegm in the back of your throat and rattle it. So that's how Weitzman got to see Truman, and Truman gave him his word that he would recognize the state of Israel. And I know that Golda Meir said they had a birthday party at Weissman for Dewey and for Harry Levine, who was his sidekick. And they always did everything together for Weitzman. Harry Levine was also a tremendous mensch from Leominster. And Golda Meir said she doesn't know of any other two men who have contributed as much to the forming of the state as Dewey and Harry. And they were ardent. I remember in '51, I was at college, I was at BU then, and he brought, Ben Gurion came to the country, and he brought Ben Gurion to Brandeis. I was at BU, and he asked me to come and be there. And I was like, wow. I mean, it was, here were the two kings were walking down the aisle at Brandeis. And Uncle Dewey escorted Ben Gurion all over the country when he came to be with him and introduce him and, you know, what have you, and make sure that he got proper accord. And I was a sophomore freshman in college, actually. And, you know, it was always reason to just feel really, really good about who your family is and how Hashem has absolutely blessed you with your forebears, because you can't pick your family, you know, God says, you know, here you are. And I just feel very humbled and very grateful to have had this kind of a background and this kind of a family to be able to look up to. And, you know, whether you're observant, whether you're not observant, you're Jewish. And you don't know what goes on in the heart. Hitler didn't care whether you observed or whether you didn't observe. Well, if he didn't care, then, you know. But how do we feel about the state today? I don't know.
What do you know about his role in the Aliyah, illegal immigration, the ships that were being purchased?
He was very concerned with the refugees, I know that. And he thought it was crucial, which is one of the reasons he was instrumental in buying the Exodus. What happened, unfortunately, is that the Exodus had to go back. But I know that the refugees were extremely important to him, even to the Ethiopian refugees, which came later. I know there were pictures of Uncle Dewey with Ethiopian children, and every time he came to Israel, he came back with wonderful stories and people that he had met and things that had happened, and he was extremely involved and caring about the refugees, and was committed to doing whatever he could to. I mean, he was chairman of the Jewish Agency for 8 years, I think, or 12 years. He was chairman of the United Jewish Appeal for 8 years. He was, I mean, wherever there was a chance for him to make a difference, that's where he was.
When the Exodus and the other ships that were being, was he using his own money? Was he fundraising for
He was
it?
both. Both. He used a lot of his own money, and he raised. He was a phenomenal fundraiser. Aunt Ann was thrilled. I was given the chairmanship of the women's division for Boston. An Orthodox woman had never been there before. An Orthodox woman had never been involved in the Federation community before. And as a matter of fact, I went to the Rav because I was scared out of my wits. First of all, Uncle Dewey's money isn't my money. I'm not on that level at all. And these women were first beginning to give in 5-figure dimensions. I didn't know how to relate to these people. And I went to the Rav and I said, what do I do? And he said, you have to do it. And I said, why? Where do I come to this? He said, it's a moment in history. You have to do it. So I said, okay, but how? I mean, they don't keep kosher. Not one of them keeps kosher. I don't know where to begin with these people. He said, you make believe it's a chocolate cake. You sit down, you eat a whole chocolate cake at once. You don't do that. You take one piece at a time. That's what you do. You take one event at a time. You don't take the past event. You don't take the next event. You take this event, whatever it is, and you start. I said, yeah, but these women like to be hostesses. They take pride in their baking and their presentations and whatever. He says, it starts with you. You buy. And you're kosher. You buy. And you present it. And you set out fruit. And you start in your home the way you do it and show them what to do. And that's what they do. It took me 18 years, Eric. 18 years before everything became kosher. And how did it become kosher? They finally called a meeting of all of the trustees and all of the past presidents, and I asked to make a presentation before they started the meeting, and they allowed me to do that. And I got up and I spoke to them about leadership and about loyalty and about Judaism and about what's coming in the next generation, what kind of a model, about follow me, about all of these things. And then I sat down. And Sidney Rabinowitz got up, who was the first head of CJP. He slammed his fist on the table. And he said, I am sick and tired of hearing all of this nonsense about kashrus and having it come up year after year after year. And if we don't decide today to make everything kosher at every single event, I'm done. And there was dead silence in the room, and it voted practically unanimously, and every event after that was kosher. Lou Weinstein, who had been president of the National Council of Federations, got up and said, does this mean that I have to have a washing table now too? So I just looked at him and I said, you wear a necktie, what for? He said, what? I said, why are you wearing a necktie? What does that got to do with anything? I said, you wear it because it matches your suit, it makes you feel good, it looks neat, it's pretty, it's attractive. But it's not necessary, really. It really doesn't serve a purpose other than to make you uncomfortable in the summer. and maybe a napkin. I mean, what are you, I said, so you know what? Make believe the Warchatz table is a punch table. You want some, you take it. You don't want some, you don't take it. It doesn't do anything but take up space. Don't worry about it, Lou. You don't have to use it. He didn't know what to, he was so angry. He didn't know what to do with me. That was it. But Aunt Anne was so, Uncle Dewey had passed away already. The year that he passed away was the year I took the chairmanship, and he was not well enough to even know that I had taken it. But Aunt Anne was so excited, and she was so proud, I guess, that somebody was following on in Uncle Dewey's footsteps in the same arena where he was. Not that I come up to his shoelaces, I don't, but at least it was recognized, and I'm sure that's half the reason they asked me was because I was his niece, if not the whole reason. But it worked. It worked, and he set a very high standard, but he could fundraise like nobody's business, and he could get water out of a stone. He really, he was a very, very effective fundraiser. Even in his business, I mean, he told the customer what the customer wanted. It was, he would have two phones, one on each ear, and he would be saying to this company, you want this, 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 and that, and I'll have it for you on Monday. And he'd say to the next company, you want this, this, and that, and I'll have it for you on Tuesday. And he was unbelievable. He was just unbelievable. They had a business suite at the Waldorf Astoria. Oh, that's a story you'd be fascinated with. Before the vote at the UN in '47, he had a suite at the business suite at the Waldorf Astoria. And if you wanted to use the suite, you let him know in advance what weekend you wanted to use it. And the whole family had access to that suite. So we used to go in for weekends every so often, not pay a dime, and just sit in the Waldorf. I mean, how cool is that? And that was open to the whole family, everybody. But in '47, the whole family came into New York. I had never been on a train. I had never been to New York. I was like, whoa, 15 years old. And what suite did he have? He had the suite of the Shah of Iran. And all my aunts and uncles and my cousins stayed in that suite. I mean, there were like 15 bedrooms or something. It was crazy. And the day of the vote, he went to the UN with my Uncle Harry, and the rest of us sat at this huge, huge table with each of us had a pad of paper and a pencil, and we had this radio in the middle of the table because there was no television there, and we had a radio, and we would listen to the UN from at this table, and we checked off all the states as they, and of course when it came that, we had gotten it, the room just exploded in excitement. It was really amazing. And of course Uncle Dewey was at the UN, and we were all so excited for him, as much as we were that the state was recognized, but for Uncle Dewey this was like huge. And that was amazing. That was amazing.
Was he involved before trying to help get the votes in favor of the...
Oh, yeah, he was. He was involved with Haganah.
Harry was...
Harry was his brother. He was a judge, an older brother, right? He was a judge. And apparently there were things that the family were vowed never to talk about that Harry did. But Harry was involved in getting the Central American states to recognize Israel at that time.
Was there a story with Somoza in Nicaragua?
Yeah. He had met him in the hospital, and they became very good friends. And apparently Somoza was upset that nobody had really recognized him appropriately in America. And Uncle Harry vowed to change that. So apparently Somoza came at one point, and he had appointed Harry the honorary consul to Nicaragua. and Uncle Harry had arranged somehow, I don't know how, with a lot of people to have this huge reception for Somoza that he had never gotten before. And Somoza felt like $1 million. And Harry was effective in helping him convince the Central American countries, most of them, to vote for Israel. And they were the countries that, through the thing, made it go. So, you know, it's and you don't realize when you're making history that you are in fact making history. And I don't think Dewey or Harry did it to make history. They did it because they felt a commitment to their people. And Harry was intermarried. Harry's wife was not Jewish. She grew up in a convent. And her last name was Grossman. And they had an enormous, Dewey had a very small home for somebody of his measure. Uncle Harry had an estate. It was a whole block. And he had a garage that housed 7 cars. He had a phone in his car before mobile phones were ever dreamed about. You know, he was like the Dick Tracy of the and he had this big phone in his car. I never knew why. I had no idea why. I never found out. I still don't know why. But it was amazing. And his in-laws lived with him. And it was always Grandma Grossman. And she was as Irish Catholic as they come. And he became very involved, not religiously, but politically, with the Catholic, with the Pope, not with the Pope, with the Cardinals, and with Cardinal Cushing, and with, the next Cardinal that came in. He was very involved with them. And he was a very big giver to the Catholic College. I remember we went to a dedication. He was given an honorary doctorate because he had dedicated the library in memory of my grandmother. I remember my mother was sitting there and she's saying, Bubba's turning over in her grave. Mama's turning over in her grave. Because apparently my mother came from a religious home, but I didn't know that. I never knew that. So my mother never sewed. She never cooked. She never shopped on Saturday, and I never knew why. She listened to the opera. She turned on lights, and they drove, but she never did any of those other things. I never knew why. Do we do that? I don't know.
What's beeping?
Probably my phone.
Let's take a break, please.